Thank you so much, Kevin, and thanks everyone for coming to my session today. I wanted to actually start by saying that even though I'm going to be talking about doing a second edition, I hope that a lot of what I have to say will apply to writing any kind of book or project, and even if you're not working on a second edition or maybe haven't done one yet, I hope that you'll still get a lot out of the session. As Kevin just said, I'm a historian, but I also hope that a lot of what I have to say will apply to you, no matter what discipline you might come out of. And I think that that's really one of the great things about TAA is that we come from so many different disciplines. And Kevin and I were talking before the session just about how much we value the organization and how much we've gotten out of it. I know I've gotten a tremendous amount out of it, and even working on this project, as I'll talk about later, some things I think would not have gone as well if I didn't have the resources of TAA supporting me as I worked on this. So I'm really glad that you all are here. I'm not and talking about this subject because I'm an expert on doing second editions, and that I've done tons of second editions. I've just finished my first second edition. I was asked by my publisher, Bloomsbury, to do a second edition of this particular book, and was very excited that for the first time getting asked to do a second edition. But I felt like I learned a lot from working on this project. And while it was fresh in my mind, I thought that I would share some of what I learned. I thought this would be a great place to do that. And hopefully you guys will get something out of what I have to tell you about my own experience. So that's pretty much what I'm going to be talking about is how to get and how I went about it, and some of the things that I learned, and some things you guys might want to think about if you find yourself in the same situation of how we get from the first edition, the cover of which you see on the left, and the second edition, which the cover of which you see on the right. And as Kevin mentioned, it's not out just yet, but it is going into production very, very soon, and hopefully will be out sooner rather than later. So I divided my presentation today into 4 sections. I thought I would talk a little bit about what I did, and how I handled the process of getting from the first edition to the second edition. Then I made a little list that I'll share with you about what I thought worked particularly well. Then I will share with you what I thought didn't work so well, and I'll conclude by talking a little bit about what I would do differently next time. Hopefully there will be a next time when I find myself doing a second edition. So what I did, well, of course, if you're going to do a second edition, the first thing you need to do is to write a proposal. And when you write your proposal for the second edition, you really want to focus on why there needs to be a second edition and what the second edition is going to bring that the first edition didn't. In my case, this was pretty easy to make that case because my book, my first edition came out in 2017. And although this might seem to be, I know depending on the discipline and depending on the nature of textbooks, some new editions come out pretty regularly, but that might seem to be a little bit soon. But in my case, as you might know, a lot has happened since 2017 in Britain and Ireland. Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol, Boris Johnson, COVID. I mean, so many things have happened that have just not only changed the course of British history in the present, but any historian will tell you that when things change in the present, it really changes the way you view the past. It changes the story because now you have a new ending to the story. And so that changes how you look and what is considered to be important about the past. So that's kind of what I focused on in writing the proposal. And then, of course, it's an opportunity to take into consideration newer research, new books, new scholarship that's coming out all the time, which is always part of a case, I would think, whatever your discipline, for making a proposal to do a second edition. So you all know the process, you probably do, where you write the proposal, you send it to your editor, the editor sends it out to anonymous reviewers, they read the proposal and they give you feedback. So I had an idea of what I wanted to do with the second edition, but of course, it's always very, very valuable to get that feedback from your reviewers. And so I went through that very, very thoroughly, very, very carefully. I took copious notes and sort of compiled a list of things that I wanted to make sure that I addressed based on their feedback, in addition to the things that I'd already put into the proposal. There were also things in the proposal, in some instances, reviewers differed, but in some ways, they thought, oh, this is really good. Yes, we need the second edition. Oh, he's great that you're going to do this, but you don't really need to do that. Just for example, one of my ideas when I wrote the proposal was, I was thinking about the popularity of the I think it's the Netflix series, The Crown, and all of the interest that has generated in the British monarchy, which is always, a hugely popular, subject. And I was thinking, well, maybe I should capitalize on that. I didn't really do a lot with the modern monarchy in my first volume. So maybe I should do more on Queen Elizabeth and Prince Charles and Princess Di and all of that. Of course, they're in there, but not a lot. Well, the reviewers came back and kind of said, no, you don't really need to do that. You don't really want to do that. It's not really that kind of book. And I listened to that, and it saved me a lot of time and a lot of work, because I had plenty to do anyway, because I just sort of decided that, yeah, they're probably right. That might not be as important or as necessary as some of the other things that I really needed to address. So I think it's, I know you should have in mind the book that you want to write, and you should never do anything that I think a reviewer suggests just because the reviewer suggests it. You want to bring your own perspective and your own priorities to it. But I just find it so valuable to get that additional perspective that I really recommend studying that feedback and really using that to do the best possible book that you can, whether you're working on a first edition or whether you're doing a second edition. So then I said, okay, well, I've got a certain amount of time to do this edition. I'm not going to just rush into to dive into revising it, right? I'm going to do, I'm having my list of topics and things that I knew I wanted to add and research. I've been keeping track of new literature that I thought I might want to incorporate in a second edition. So I said, let me do some background reading. Let me spend a few months just reading, doing research, taking notes before I even sit down to write. So that was one of the things that I did. I had they gave me a much, as publishers tend to do, gave me a much sooner deadline than I had proposed, but they gave me, I guess, about 6 months, or maybe 6, 7, 8 months by the time from the time that we sort of agreed to do this. So I felt like I had you know how fast time goes, but I sort of felt like I had some time that I could do some prep work before I really started to get into my revision. And so then before I sat down to actually revise, then I had to really conceptualize what I wanted to do with this second edition. Of course, that was part of the proposal, but the reason I put this in as a separate step is because I think you kind of, when you actually sit down to start revising, I recommend thinking again about having it in your mind, what's your priority? What do you want to focus on? What do you want to make sure that you add? What's the story that you're trying to tell? Where are you really going with this that might be different than what you did in the first volume, to really guide how you prioritize and what you included and what you deleted and what you added. And that the reason I titled my session the way that I did is because deleting is a very important, I found out that deleting is a very, very important part of doing a second edition, because you're doing a second edition because you've reconceptualized it to a degree. So what did you do in the first edition that doesn't fit with that new conceptualization? You didn't want to just start, I didn't want to just start, deleting things willy-nilly. I had to have a plan and a conceptualization of what was going to fit in the second edition and what was not. So then, as we all do, and I strongly recommend, then I made my schedule. How am I going to make sure that I get this done in the time that I have to do it? The only way to do that is to make a schedule and to try to stick to it. And so I have to move you guys over so I can see what I wrote here. And so, yeah, revise each chapter, right. So I knew that one of the things I knew I wanted to do was I didn't want to just add a new ending. I wanted there to be something different about every single chapter. And so when I started this process, I realized, and I don't know that I planned to start because of this, but when I started to do the revisions, I realized that I had about 20 weeks to revise the book. And there are 20 chapters in the book. Well, 19 chapters in introduction, so basically 20 chapters. So of course, that means that I suddenly realized I had about a week to do each chapter. So I had to be very careful about my time. So in making a schedule, I said, well, okay, so in making a schedule, I figured, well, how am I gonna revise a chapter a week? That seemed like a lot. Well, when you have a project like this, of course, Kevin and I were talking, the many tips that we get from TAA are so valuable. And one of the most important ones that you probably would hear a lot of textbook authors share is you've got to break things down into their component parts. So I said, okay, that sounds overwhelming. How am I going to do 20 chapters in 20 weeks? Well, okay, let's give it a chapter a week. How am I going to do one chapter in a week? Well, here's how I'm going to do it. So here's how I'll just share a little bit. So here's how I did it. I teach 2 days a week. I didn't have a sabbatical, so I was still teaching 3 classes while I was working on this. Well, some of it was in the summer and some of it was in January when I wasn't teaching, but for 4 months, 4 of the 6 or 8 months that I was working on it, I was teaching. So I teach Monday and Wednesday. I teach a late morning class, and then I teach an afternoon class, and one in a week I teach an evening class. So I've got even the days that I teach, I've got a pretty big break on Monday and Wednesday between getting out of class at 1 and my next class at 4:30. So I can set aside at least an hour and a half, 2 hours on those days. And when I'm at work, I'm, other things going on. Maybe I didn't want to write those days. So I set aside those afternoons to at least spend some time doing additional reading, additional research, additional note taking related to the particular chapter that I was going to work on that week. And that worked out really, really well, because what I was able to do was, having sort of gone through these other steps and conceptualized what I wanted to do with the book, having done a lot of already background reading and note taking, I could start by saying, okay, what is it that I need to do with this particular chapter? What else do I need to know? What other sources do I need to look at that are going to allow me to do with this chapter what I want to do with it? And so I really kind of devoted Monday and Wednesday to doing that. On Tuesday morning, what I did was I would read through the whole chapter. And as I read through it, I would read through it very, very carefully. And I would think about what, first of all, I would, even though it's already been published, there's always, as you guys, I'm sure all know, there's always editing that no matter how many times you read a book, there's always things you're going to feel that you can say better, do better, that you just like better, you're just thinking differently. So I kind of went through it very carefully, did whatever rewording, whatever reorganization. Okay, I don't really need that. Let me take that out. And I kind of just took Tuesday morning just to go through the chapter to kind of prepare it for what I wanted to add into it. Then on Thursday, I would be able to take the notes and the additional materials that I'd gathered on Monday and Wednesday and fold them into the chapter, and make the revisions and make the additions. Obviously, this was going to be easier in some chapters than others. Just some chapters needed, depending on what I was doing, just needed more time, needed more revisions. But other chapters didn't need as much. But this generally worked out pretty well. And then so Thursday morning, Friday morning, Saturday mornings, I devoted to revising those chapters. If I finished Thursday and I realized I needed more information, then I would do that additional research on Friday and then do the rewriting on Saturday. So obviously, any writing project, really, really important to make a schedule. That was a schedule that worked really, really well for me. And so I thought I might, give you some idea of what I did. And then I also knew that I had, as is true with any book project, there are always things that you need to do at the end. You just, my publisher asked for abstracts of every chapter and keywords for every chapter, the list of illustrations, the acknowledgements, just all of the things that go into making a book that, that don't really belong to being part of a chapter revision. I knew I had to make time to do that. In my deadline was January 31st. I knew that I was going to have at least the first half of January off, and the workload is usually a little lighter at the beginning of a semester. So I kind of had set aside the January to not finish revising the chapters I needed to revise, but also to take care of those final steps, like preparing the illustrations list, writing a new introduction, writing abstracts, keywords for each chapter, writing new acknowledgements. And so that's what I did. And so in short, or maybe not in such short, but that's a pretty good, should give you a pretty good idea of what I did in order to write a second edition of a book that I'd already written. So that all sounds like it just went great and was really smooth and really easy, right? Well, not exactly, but some things I thought did work really, really well. So what worked for me? My schedule mostly worked for me. There were some weeks when, as always happens, things come up, or you get a little bit behind, or some morning that some crisis, family crisis, or something emerges. Somebody needs your help with something, and it's not something that you can say, as important as it is. And you'll probably hear that a lot at this conference. You probably, as important it is to protect your writing time, that sometimes you just can't do that, and you just have to put people ahead of but mostly, and I've got a very, very supportive family, a very, very nice situation at home, nice home office, nice place to work. People let me do my writing. My family lets me do my writing. But like I said, sometimes things are going to come up, and so then you just adjust, and you just work a little bit more on Friday or Saturday, or you reconceptualize your schedule, whatever. But it's important not to get discouraged and not to sort of throw everything out if you get thrown off. But my schedule mostly worked. I thought listening to my reviewers really, really worked well. I'm really happy with the edition that came out, and it wouldn't have been, if I just done it on my own and just listened to my own head, it wouldn't have been as good, nearly as good, I think. So they gave me great, great suggestions, great ideas, not only for what to include, for what needed more attention, for certain resources that they suggested I looked at. There wasn't one thing that they told me to do that I did that I regretted doing. So that's, again, something that I recommend a lot. When I sat down with my own proposal and with the feedback that I got from my reviewers, as I mentioned earlier, made a list of the changes that I wanted to make, and then I kind of prioritized those changes. That I would say that mostly worked, but it really helped to give me kind of a roadmap of what I wanted to do, so that when I started revising a chapter, I wasn't just, oh, what am I going to do with this chapter? I already had like a long list of things that I wanted to address, make sure that I addressed. And so, okay, well, let me pull the things from this chapter out of that list and make sure that I do that. So that mostly worked. So I did get to another thing that again, I sort of highly recommend. I got to a point in, I mentioned my deadline was at the end of January, and I got to a point in about November where, even though things were mostly working, and I'll talk about this little in a minute when I talk about what didn't work, even though things were mostly working, I got to a point in November when I kind of panicked. And I thought, okay, now this isn't working. There's no way I'm going to be able to finish this. I started to get really nervous. And one of the reasons that I got nervous was that I started out by revising chapter 1 first, and then chapter 2, and then chapter 3. I was just going to go through the revisions like that and do a chapter a week. And 20 weeks, I'll be done, right? Well, I started to panic because I realized that my conclusion, which was really like a whole new chapter, about the length of the other chapters on 21st century, on Britain Ireland in the 21st century, was going to be almost entirely new. And I kind of realized that I was going to need more. I was going to need more than a week probably to do that. And I started to think that that other things weren't getting done that I should be prioritizing, and I just kind of felt like I needed some help. And TAA came to the rescue, because I get this, and if you guys haven't done this, I highly recommend it. So I got this email from TAA saying, apply for a free mentoring session. And I don't care how many books you've written, how experienced you are. It's like, if you give me a chance to have a mentoring session, I'm going to sign up for a mentoring session, because I always get something out of it. And I always end up thinking, what would I have done if I hadn't gone to that mentoring session? So I get this email, sign up, apply for a free mentoring session. So I did. And I got one, and they assigned me Mary Beth Averill. I'm going to give her a shout out, some credit here. And so we had like an hour phone conversation, and she asked the right questions, and she helped me to talk through what it was that I was struggling with, what I needed to do. She said, first of all, just listening kind of to what I just told you guys, said, stop what you're doing now and write the conclusion now. Just if that's what's weighing on your mind, write the conclusion. That's going to be the biggest change. That's the most important thing. You don't want to rush that at the end. And so I that's what I did. I kind of rearranged my whole schedule, and that's just an example. She gave me a lot of other ideas, but that's probably the most important one that I would use just to illustrate that this was of great value to me. So if you are in the middle of a second edition, a first edition, a third edition, or whatever, and you feel yourself getting stuck or behind or adrift, or just need somebody to talk to, just need a little extra confidence or whatever, I think mentoring sessions are great, and that really, really worked for me. So that was one of the other things that worked. Asking for help is never a bad idea. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to include more. One of the things I said was going to be different about my second edition was it was going to have more illustrations, and it was especially going to have more maps. I had some in the first edition, but one of the things that the reviewer said was needs more maps. I said, okay, great. Where am I going to get maps from? I mean, obviously, you can pay a lot of money and have people do this or whatever, but one of my colleagues at Monmouth, Jeff Fuad, another shout out, somebody who came to the rescue, is a GIS professor, and that's what he does. And I said, and he'd offered before for something else I was working on. He said, my students need projects. If you need, if you need them to do maps for things, tell me what you need, and we'll work on it. So I said, Jeff, if I, gave you a list of maps that I ideally would want, is that something that you think that you could do for me? And he said, well, yeah, let's set up let's wait till the end of the semester, and let's set up a Zoom session and talk through what you need, and I'll see what I can do. Well, he ended up doing 10 maps for me, and without charging me, because this is like a credit for him, and it's what he does, academically, in addition to writing and stuff. He really seemed happy to do it. So just asking, getting help from TAA, getting help from Mary Beth, talking through things with colleagues. If you've got colleagues with particular expertise that can help you with something, you don't have to do everything. I guess the main point is that you just don't have to do everything yourself. So that worked out so well for me. That was another thing that worked. And another thing that worked was I did end up meeting my deadline, and the reviews came back, and they were very, very happy with them. They were very positive and enthusiastic. And so this was, a success story. The last thing that I would say what worked was that I also is, so it's one thing to say what you're going to do, and then after you do it, you say, okay, what have I done? And how are we going to market this book? And so that's the last thing that I would recommend is making a list of now what's different about the second edition. So this is just the list that I made up from my text. Expanded coverage of the ancient, medieval, and early modern periods through the 17th century. The first edition, I purposefully weighted it much more heavily to the modern times, because I thought that would be a selling point of the book. But reviewers came back and said, some of the reviewers came back and said they'd like to see more balance between the earlier periods and the later periods. So that meant making sure that I expanded the early chapters, streamline later chapters to bring the book more into balance between earlier and later periods. So that meant that I had to make the later chapters, some of the later chapters, in some cases, significantly shorter. So that's where some of the deleting had to come in, and I had to think, okay, in some instances, I don't need this section. It's not like, oh, let me reduce the word count here and there. Let me, take a sentence out of this paragraph or this paragraph. I really had to sort of reconceptualize that, but hopefully this will be a selling point. Inclusion of up-to-date scholarship published since the first edition. I think that would apply to anybody in any discipline of what you would want to use as a selling point for your second edition. Up-to-date coverage of Brexit and the coronavirus pandemic, I've mentioned as an important distinguishing characteristic. I didn't mention this before, but one of the main things that I did earlier in the text was to give increased attention to earlier pandemics and breakthroughs in medical knowledge and practice, which suddenly seemed more important and more relevant to telling the story of the history of Britain and Ireland. And that was one of the things that I especially wanted to do in this book. Greater inclusivity related to race, gender, and ethnicity. When I was running down the list of all the things that have happened since 2017, I easily could have also mentioned Black Lives Matter, that #MeToo movement, and the increasing controversy about culture wars and the history wars that we're very familiar with in this country, and they're just as pronounced in Britain too. So it was important that I thought, and this was also a place where the reviewers really helped, was not only to include attention to those developments in the last chapter, but to make sure that the earlier chapters included, and not that I neglected them in the first. In fact, I really tried to be inclusive in the first, but I really wanted to even expand that further, given current concerns and current development. I mentioned earlier increased maps and images. So those are the things that work. Here's a couple sample maps that Jeff did for me. Some were just sort of basic, straightforward, geographical maps. Here's Britain and Ireland at the time of the civil wars of the mid 17th century. Here's when showing where some of the major battles occurred that are talked about in the text. And then he did other things that were even a little bit more substantive in terms of presenting not just geography, but information such as where's unemployment highest during the early years of Margaret Thatcher's reign, which helps to explain why some districts voted Labour and other districts voted Conservative. So there's just a couple samples of that. Okay, what didn't work, and I think I'm doing good with time because I've done plenty of time to give you guys a chance to talk, add hopefully suggestions or ideas of your own, but also I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Anyway, what didn't work? I thought that I spent too much time on the background reading before starting revisions. I kind of felt like last summer, I've got this lead time, we've got plenty of time, let me just focus on that. And I don't think it was a bad idea, but I think I gave myself too much time before starting the revisions, and that made things a little more stressful and made things a little bit more packed for me than ideally I think that I would have liked them to have been when I was actually making the revisions. So that didn't work out as well as I thought. Related to some things I talked about earlier, starting with chapter 1 and going through forward, that didn't work out. I had to completely change things around. And it's interestingly because when I've written my other books, I don't always write from first chapter to the end. I don't know how you guys do it. I'd be interested in hearing different perspectives and takes on this. But sometimes I will write other chapters first. When I wrote an earlier book just on Ireland's history of Ireland, and at the time I hadn't published as much as I have now, and my publisher wanted to have me to write 3 sample chapters that they could submit to reviewers. So I wrote a chapter on the Reformation, I wrote a chapter on the famine period, and I wrote a chapter on the Troubles. And I thought, well, these are the 3 most controversial, contentious topics in all of Irish history. And if I can write them successfully and in balance, then I can show the reviewers that that I can handle the rest of the book. And that I got the contract, I got the book published. So just for a variety of reasons, you might start with other chapters, but doing a second edition, that didn't work out well for me as much as if I had, I think, prioritized which chapters I wanted to give the most attention to, and maybe making sure that they got done first. This is probably something that we all share as authors. We start on a project, we think we've got all the time in the world, and so we start slowly and then accelerate as we get closer to the deadline. So I don't know if there's a solution to that, but that doesn't work out as well as I think we ever hope that it will. So I think I would have, like I said, I think I would have accelerated my schedule a little bit, which kind of leads me, and this is maybe a little bit redundant, but so what would I do differently if I were to do another second edition? I would begin revising and writing sooner. Maybe schedule time to do my background reading and research, but also dive in and make time to do the revising and start the revising and the writing as soon as I know that I'm going to do the book. As I mentioned, I think I would start with the most important changes that I wanted to make instead of going through chapter by chapter and then getting stressed out that I'm going to run out of time and I'm going to leave something really, really important out. In fact, like even though I was coming toward the end in January, it was really not stressful for me because I'd actually gotten to a point where I'd written my conclusion. I'd done the most important revisions that I felt like I needed to do in my other chapters. And now I kind of felt like, okay, I've still got a list of things I want to do, and I'll get through as much of it as I can. But if I don't get through all of it, I know that I will have revised this enough to have made a good case for a second edition, and I will have done the most important things that I wanted to do. So that really, if I would have known that sooner, I think that the whole process would have been a little bit easier and a little bit less stressful for me. So yeah, I'd be more strict with my time earlier. I set up a pretty strict schedule. Once I got into my fall semester, I probably should have done that in the summer. And that might have allowed me to build in more of a break for the busy times of the semester, for the holidays. I did take some, time off. I mentioned I had 20 weeks for 20 chapters. I actually think that I had 21 for 20, and kind of thought, well, let me allow for a week, during the holidays when I just, I'm not going to work on it. So I think it's important to build those breaks into your schedule, whatever you're working on, and just be realistic about that not all weeks are created equal. And as much as you want to have and I love to have, my wife will tell me, I love to have my schedule, and I am always happy when I'm on my schedule. She sets her watch by my schedule, but not all weeks are equal, and you have to build some of those breaks in to give yourself some extra time. If I'd known that I was going to do this and how much I would have applied for a sabbatical to work on it. Wasn't in the cards this time, but definitely always something to keep in mind. And if I found out that I was going to do another second edition, I would. And I knew that I had time to apply for a sabbatical and time to get it done. That's another thing that I would do differently. And that's my presentation. That's what I did. That's what I thought worked, things I thought it didn't work, and what I would do differently. So I think that I will stop sharing my screen so that I can see everybody, but there's my information if anybody wants to follow up with any questions or get in touch for any reason. So thank you all for being here and for your attention. And I'm going to open it up, turn it back over to Kevin, and open it up for you guys to talk and whatever you want to talk about. Any questions you guys want to
ask? Thanks a lot, Ken. This reminds me of those YouTube videos where you can watch people doing different things like woodworking, playing a video game or whatever, to see how they do it and see how it works. And, oh, I should do it that way. And that's what it felt like here, especially when you got to the part about, what didn't work. And I want to know that because I want to avoid those things or do it differently or whatever. So really appreciate you, really sharing the ups and downs and ins and outs of all of that. And if anybody has any questions that they have for Ken, or just want to throw it out to the group, that would work as well. So you can raise your hand in the little reaction button area if you want, or.
And as I said, I love to learn from other people too. So if you guys have things that that I and other people can learn from, I'd love to hear your suggestions as well.
I do have one question, but this is just to throw out to the group. I've always wondered this. My books are in human anatomy, physiology. Ken, you're working in history and so on. And I always wondered that the people that do math textbooks, when they're doing, when Ken was mapping out which chapters to do first and so on, do the math authors, do they do all the odd ones first and then all the even ones, like, we always did in math class with our homework? So I'm just throwing that out there. If any of you are math authors, you could answer that question for me. But what else we have several hands. Ken Saladin, why don't you go ahead and pop in?
Right. Yeah, Ken, like Kevin, I write in human anatomy and physiology. And I have a 10th edition, which is in page proofs now, due out in January. I always find as I have one edition in production, I'm already building a list of things I want to add or do differently or do better in the next edition. So with my 10th in press, I already have a 25-page list of changes I plan to make in the 11th. And I just wonder if you, working on your second edition, began accumulating changes that you put aside for your third.
Oh, that's a great question, Ken, and congratulations on your 10th edition. Wow, that's really impressive. Yeah, so yeah, that is a great question. Sort of, I guess, is my answer to that. I've been so involved in working on this edition, and I've got a couple of other projects that I'm working on this summer and for the rest of this year. But yeah, I think that I'm always I'm always making lists and accumulating notes and ideas for for books and checking the Journal of British Studies and the books that are out, and making notes of things that that I just want to keep in the back of my mind, that that if there were a third edition, those are the kinds of things that I would go back to. So I don't really have like a third edition list yet, but that's actually a really good idea. I think that I will start that actually. So thanks.
Yes, I always find, well, there are advances in the field, especially in human physiology, that come out too late to put into the edition you're working on, if they're important enough to put in there to begin with. But I find sometimes when I'm frustrated with certain passages or paragraphs, I just have to let it go and say, this is a paragraph that could probably use improvement in the next edition, and come to it then. You can't achieve perfection in one edition. You just kind of set a few ideas aside and say, I'll give this a shot next time, and maybe it'll come out a little better.
Oh yeah, I mean, I forget where I read this or who said this, but that a finished unperfect book is better than an unfinished perfect book.
Yeah.
And there's really, yeah, like you said, there's really no such thing as a perfect book. And no matter, like I said, no matter how many times I read my work, I always find things that I would that I would change. But you do the best you can, and get the feedback you can, and yeah.
Yeah, I've also heard it put something like perfection is the enemy of completion.
Yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah.
A good one. We have another hand raised. We have a user listed as Wankat.
Phil Woncat.
Oh, okay.
And my question is, did your publisher give you a percentage of new material they wanted in the second edition?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Bill. When I did my proposal, I suggested that, what did I suggest? That there would be 20% new material, and I would reduce what was currently in the book by 10%. So I proposed that the book would be 10% longer than the first edition, but that but the 20% of it would be new material, and they seem to be quite happy with that. Now they did give me a word count, and then I submitted the second edition by my deadline, and then they sent it out to the reviewers. And as I said, the reviews came back and they were very positive, and they all recommended publication and everything. But they had some additional things that said, but it would even be better if I liked it, but it would even be better if he included this and this and this and this. So at that point, my editor sent me the reviews and asked me, what I, to reply what I thought of them. And I said, well, these are great ideas, but if I do these further editions, that's going to make the book longer than the word limit that you gave me. They gave me a pretty generous word limit. I mean, I think the book is like 260,000 words or something like that. So they said, well, how many more words do you think you need in order to make these additional changes? And I share this because maybe this will, help, somebody in terms of, talking to their, editors. And just as a sort of a pure guess, I mean, I knew that it wasn't like the equivalent of a whole chapter that they were asking me to do. And so, chapters are, roughly, well, I said like 263,000 words, 20 chapters, but you figure roughly about 10,000 words a chapter. So I said, well, I think I could probably make these changes in 5,000 words. So they said, okay, we'll give you you've got another 5,000 words. And, so that's just part of how the negotiation went. But uncannily, I didn't count words as I was making these additions, and I just finished. And I said, okay, let me compare the additions. And it was almost exactly 5,000 words longer. So I was really kind of thrilled about that, kind of like took that as a divine sign that, everything was, the way it was supposed to be.
Well, the reason I ask is Pearson told me they wanted 30 or 35%.
And what field, Bill?
It's engineering.
Engineering. Yeah. So is that, do you think because of changes in the field, or why do you think they wanted so much?
I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds really high to me. I don't know. I think it probably, I don't know if other people have other experiences they could share, but that sounds really high to me. I think 20% is probably a good enough amount.
I came in with about 30%. I didn't get to 35.
Yeah, well, that's really good.
I do have a question in the chat here, a clarification. Ando Johnson wants to know, was the second edition prompted or requested by the publisher, or did you initiate it based on your interest in updating the first edition?
It was requested by the publisher. It had gotten good reviews and apparently good enough sales, although you wouldn't know it by the size of my royalty checks, but apparently good enough sales. Maybe that's probably another session I need to go to, but yeah, no, they said, what did I think about doing a second edition of this book? And so that got me thinking. I said, well, yeah, absolutely. As I said, it was really a little bit of a no-brainer with this because of the really concentrated and almost cataclysmic changes that have occurred in Britain and Ireland in particular, just within the past 5 years. So it sounded like a great idea to me, but I tend to finish a project and then already have 1 or 2 projects that I've already started to work on, and so I've been more interested in doing different things, but I highly recommend this. This was a great experience. It was different, but it's kind of really a great experience in and of itself. And I do have a Western Civ 2-volume Western Civ textbook that I wrote some years ago that the publisher that published it was acquired by a bigger publisher, and Routledge now owns the rights to it. And I did write to them to see if at some point they might be interested in doing a second edition of that. So I'm certainly open to doing more second editions, and I think it's entirely appropriate to propose that to your publisher if you think one is merited, and to make the case for that. And in this case, I got a perfectly nice response about it, but saying that they just overwhelmed and could they get back to me, and I'm not pressuring them because I've got plenty to do, but that's something that I would consider doing.
Okay, we have a question. This was a direct message in the chat to me. What measures or controls do you implement to make sure that you don't overdo or exaggerate in presenting the revisions without necessarily demolishing the essentials in the previous edition?
Kevin, can you read that for me one more time, please?
Okay, yeah, that was a long one. What measures or controls do you implement to make sure that you do not overdo nor exaggerate in presenting the revisions without necessarily demolishing the essentials in the previous edition?
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think I understand. I think I understand the question. So that's a good point. You don't want to lose the things that, if I understand the question right, you don't want to lose the things that made your first book successful, which is presumably the reason why the publisher might be interested in doing a second edition. And so I think I don't know that I had like a particular control that I that I devised, other than, as I mentioned earlier, just keeping in mind what it was that that I wanted to do in this book, and with a kind of roadmap in mind of where you're going and where you want to get to and the kind of things that you want to include. Yeah, you just have to ask very carefully, is this material that you're deleting, is this taking away from the story that you want to tell? Are you leaving something out that the readers will miss, or that the the students won't understand something later because you've taken this out? And so without going into a lot of details, I just had to I think that's a great question, a great point, because you do have to sort of keep that in mind, that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't want to just revise for revision's sake. You want to keep what's important and what's good. And so and so there were things that there were things, I mean, I don't know. And just like for example, so in my, like 10 years ago, one of the big stories in Britain was a phone hacking scandal that was really just where the press, with some cooperation from the police, had been hacking into your private citizens' phones in the search of, I don't know if you remember the story when it was out, including crime victims, and it became a huge scandal, and really became kind of reflective of a general level of corruption that had really permeated not only British politics, but the press and the police and the upper levels of British society. Well, that was really important at the time, but in the case of this book, that had been superseded by more recent developments. And so it's not that I make no reference to earlier political scandals, but I had a whole section on it in the first edition, and I took that out. And because I had to make room for Brexit and COVID and Black Lives Matter and Me Too and all these other, more relevant topics. So it's just a matter of, I think, deciding, what's like I said, what's important to what you want to tell, and what maybe is, because look, even in a 350-page book, and some textbooks, history textbooks are even much longer than that. You're not. It's not an encyclopedia. You're not comprehensively covering everything. Every aspect of history. So of the history of Britain Island, it's pretty broad subject. But as you guys, and I love this, again, I love this organization, because you talk to other people who write textbooks and know what know what that's about, and there's a need for people. There's always a need for good people and good writers, to synthesize information and to put it together, and to present it in a way that students and general readers can, not only understand it, but hopefully, will help make them find, your subject interesting and compelling. And so that's what that's the main thing to me. It's so, did I leave out some things that some people might consider important? Probably any textbook would, but at the same time, I included a lot, like I said, I included a lot more about, than I did in the first edition, about slavery, about the role of Blacks in British history, about the role that they played in the abolitionist movement. There's a lot of things that I added in that I just thought justified whatever it was that I took out. So it's just, with anything, it's just a matter of prioritizing and saying, well, this is, okay, I'm taking stuff out. Am I taking stuff that's important out? Well, I must have thought it was important because it was in the first edition, but now I think something else is more important. So that's, that's the only control I would say that I really used for that.
Okay, we have one question. If you can answer it in 30 seconds, it's a short.
Probably not,
I think
but
it's a
I'll
short.
try.
No, I think you can. Okay, this is from Ken Saladin. Do you revise on PDFs or other digital versions of your previous edition, or do you write all new manuscript?
No, I took my Word edition. I took my worded draft of the first edition, and I created a new document, and that new document became the second edition. Yeah, I didn't start.
You see, I told you you could answer that.
Yeah.
In
Okay.
30 seconds.
Right.
And that's all we
I
have
did.
time for. Thanks so much, Ken. This is.
Listen, thanks everybody. I'll see you all at the rest of some of the sessions. So.